Hey everybody, and welcome to another Chairman of the Board ranking video. This is where I take a look at the last 5 new to me board games and I rank and review them in order from my least favourite up to my most favourite. Before I get started on these 5 games, I want to give a shout out to the show's sponsor, KIENDA.co.uk, who are my go-to online retailer, and if you use the link in the show notes or the QR code, then you can get 5% off your first order. At number 5, I have Kunara. Now, this is a variant on the classic filler game No Thanks. And much like No Thanks, you are trying to get as few points as possible by the time the game draws to an end. And much like No Thanks, on your turn, you have the option to take a card from the centre or to place one of your tokens on it in order to pass it on to the next player. Now, the main difference between this one and No Thanks is that instead of all the cards being worth what they're worth at face value, this one, each of the cards kind of represents a piece of a pyramid where you are essentially trying to build a pyramid of cards, and only the kind of pinnacles of those pyramids will score you points. So if you have, say, higher value cards, you can cover up with a lower value card and therefore nullify the scoring of those two beneath it. So you do have that kind of overlaying mechanism to the game, which I thought was actually very cool in principle. So I actually like the idea and concept of this one. But unfortunately, the tension is completely eradicated from the game when comparing it to a game like No Thanks, because the actual consequences of your actions don't feel quite as strong, because especially through the first, say, 75% of the game, you're not really that hesitant to pick up cards because you know you've got enough time to cover it up with lower valued cards. Also, the management of the tokens in your hand didn't really feel that tense. I personally never ran out or came near to running out because I was never that fearful to take a card. So all in all, this is so close to a game called like No Thanks that I don't see any reason to play this one because it's subpar in every single aspect. So unfortunately, I can't recommend it. That is Kunara at number 5. At number 4, I have Courtisans. So this is a kind of a set collection style game with a degree of commodity speculation, because the values of the suits of cards that you're collecting is going to either be worth positive points or negative points based on what the other players do. So this game, each turn you have 3 cards at your disposal. You're going to have to play one of them in front of you. You're going to have to play one of them in front of an opponent. And the other one is going to have to go on this banquet table, which will show whether these different suits are going to be kind of in positive values or negative values. So you have the option to play it kind of above the banquet table or below the banquet table of those relevant suits. If at the end of the game there are more cards below it, then every card that each player has collected of that type will be worth negative points. But if, again, the above the banquet table outweighs the negative points, then they're going to be worth positive points. Now, there are a few additional little tricks to the game. For example, you have these assassin cards that can eliminate cards from other players or even from yourself. So that's a good way of getting yourself out of tricky situations. You've got these spy cards that can be played face down, which kind of spices up the banquet table a little bit because you don't quite know with certainty how these things are going to end up. You have these noble cards that will have double value, and you also have these kind of shield cards that cannot be attacked by other players. Now, again, I like the concept of this game. It reminds me very much of Biblios. I mean, Biblios, you are divvying out those cards, sometimes being forced to make very difficult decisions because you might have to give your opponent quite a nice card that you didn't want to give them. But I thought that Biblios did it in a lot more interesting way by being forced to make that decision after every single card you draw. So you don't know what's going to come up next. Whereas in Courtisans, you have those 3 cards in your hand, you can see them before you make those decisions. So there's no kind of push your luck aspect of the game. Now, some people might like that, but I actually think that it takes some of the tension out, because you think, should I take this card for myself or will I get a better one later? Would it be better? Will it be worse? And so on. That is completely not in this game at all. Now, I love it visually. I think the artwork is really nice. It has this kind of like golden age Disney film vibe to it, and with these nice gilded cards. And I really wanted to like it, but sadly, it felt a bit pedestrian. It's pretty obvious what other players are going for. So, if your opponent's got a bunch of red cards in front of them, you might want to start tanking those red cards. Again, fairly obvious choices to be made there. And I was never really put in that position where, you know, I was making really crunchy, difficult decisions. So if I wanted a game with this vibe, I would play something like Biblios over this one. I suppose in its advantage, it is very fast. You know, it only takes around 15 to 20 minutes to play. Again, visually, it is lovely to look at. But yeah, sadly, didn't quite stick the landing for me. That is Courtisans at number 4. At number 3, I have Pagoda. This is a 2-player only game where you and your opponent are building these pagodas communally. So both you and your opponent are contributing to the same pieces here. Now, it's a card-driven game with a pretty interesting hand management system where 5 out of your 7 cards are actually visible to your opponent, so they can see what options you have, but don't quite have perfect information because, again, those 2 cards are hidden. Now, in this game, it's very simple, where all you're going to do is you're going to be playing these cards mostly to build these little pillars. You know, yellow cards will build yellow pillars and so on. And depending on the level of those pillars, you are going to get that many points. So on the first level, they're worth 1 point, second level, 2 points, and so on. But the kind of main vibe of this game is to not give your opponent easy opportunities, because, you know, if your opponent has a bunch of, say, blue cards in front of them, you don't want to build a base that needs blue pillars going forward. You know, you want to be making sure that you're building pillars that suit your hand and not your opponent's. But because you are forced to build at least 1 pillar each turn, you can sometimes be forced to make decisions that you don't want to do. So it's all about trying to optimally play those cards as best as possible. There are a few additional twists where if you build a new platform, you get a bonus power, which will give you, little rule-breaking abilities, such as being able to play more pillars per turn, or being able to play like a 2-for-1 mechanism, or even having more cards in your hand. They're all pretty subtle and pretty underwhelming, but they can help you in the right situation. All in all, despite me liking the concept of the game, I thought that it was a little bit too card dependent. You know, you are really just, top decking cards, hoping you get what you want. A little bit too tactical for my liking. I think that long-term decision making isn't quite there. I was trying to look for the depth in the game, but I did struggle to find it, if I'm honest. And I think if you played this game once or twice, you've pretty much seen everything the game has to offer. And it didn't have that longevity, in my opinion. You might disagree with me, I don't know. But for me, it wasn't quite strong enough to hold up to so many other great 2-player games, despite having quite a cool table presence. So that is Pagoda at number 3. At number 2, I have Mystic Vale. So this is a deck building game with a twist. In fact, it's called a card crafting game. So with most deck building games, you might know you start with a very basic deck. You get more and more cards as you go by buying new ones, adding it to your hand, shuffling and going round and round and round, until eventually you have quite a powerful deck of cards. This one, you only ever have 20 cards. And instead of adding new cards to your hand, you are kind of buffing those cards by purchasing these kind of acetate transparent slips that will go into these sleeves and make your existing cards more powerful. On paper, that sounds fantastic. That had me definitely piqued my interest. I wanted to see how the game actually played. And it does work well, but unfortunately I think my concerns became a reality, because I was thinking, is this game just another way of presenting or repackaging existing deck building mechanisms? Because in theory, you are pretty much just doing the same thing here. Instead of having another card, you are making an existing card better. And when you actually play it, it does just feel like you're playing any other deck building game, which was sadly a bit frustrating for me. Now, don't get me wrong, mechanically this game works excellently. It works exactly as it should. And it does a lot of things you'd expect for it to do. Increase your currency to get better upgrades. Some cards will give you, some upgrades will give you passive points. Some have symbols or icons on them that will let you buy these more kind of endgame scoring cards or ongoing ability cards, and so on. I suppose the additional touch of this one is that it did have a degree of push your luck, because on a number of these cards you have these little burnt tree symbols, and if you reveal too many of those, then you'll go bust. So instead of having, say, a fixed amount of drawing 6 cards per turn, as you do with a lot of deck building games, this one you can have sometimes 10 cards in front of you, if not more than that. by not revealing those burnt trees or even mitigating those burnt trees with other upgrades. So I like that part of the game for sure, but the rest of it just felt very deck buildery, it felt very generic for me, and it didn't quite differentiate itself from those sea of other deck builders. And ultimately it boiled down to that card crafting system being a bit of a gimmick, I think, rather than an actual unique mechanism. It's just, again, a different way of presenting a deck building game rather than being a unique mechanism in its own right. So still, I know there's going to be a lot of people who enjoy this. Deck building fans are going to like it. Sadly, I'm generally lukewarm on deck builders, and this was a prime example of that. Still, objectively, a good game, a strong game, but one that's definitely not going to stick around for me. That is Mystic Vale at number 2. And finally, at number 1, I have Cascadito. So this is the roll and write version of Cascadero, which you might know, recently I put a review out, which wasn't the most positive on Cascadero, and that is quite a surprise for a lot of you guys, but also for me, because it was my most anticipated game of 2024. I love running Knizia games. I love the premise of this game with the track climbing, the kind of route building, the amazing visual look of the game. But the board game version fell a bit flat because I thought it was a little bit clunky, a little bit disjointed. And when I played that original Cascadero, I thought, this game would really lend itself well to a roll and write game. And here we have Cascadito. This feels like this was the intended game and Cascadero was built after it rather than the other way around. The mechanisms are well better suited to a roll and write game because your options are just limited and restricted rather than being able to go anywhere. The board feels tighter even though you are only doing your own thing, and you are still even racing for these objectives even though you're not playing on a common board. And on top of that, you have different maps you can play with different rules that are quite subtle to quite extreme. And that tension of the dice draft shines through much stronger in this one rather than the board game where you can just go wherever you want to go. So all in all, I thought this game was really refreshing after not enjoying the core game as much as I probably should have. And yeah, this one, much more condensed. I think it's smoother. I think you can take more ownership of your board. The tension is still there by racing for those goals. Still has the cool graphic design and even has injected replayability through those different maps you can play on. So for me, if you played Cascadero and not Cascadito, I'd definitely recommend looking at Cascadito. Or if you like the idea of the game, but maybe you wanted a smaller box or you weren't sure which one to go for, I would highly recommend choosing Cascadito over Cascadero because you get the whole experience plus more in a smaller condensed box, a faster game, and yeah, I think there's no negatives on the roll and write game comparing it to the board game, and this is what I wanted it to be. So definitely like this one. I'm not quite going to give it a commendation yet because I want to play it some more. This is more of an initial impressions review. But right now it's looking quite promising, and this is what I wanted Cascadero to be. So that is Cascadito at number 1. So there we have it, that concludes another ranking video. 5 very different games here. Sadly nothing that quite came through with a solid commendation, but who knows, with repeated plays, maybe Cascadito could get there. But despite that, hopefully you have enjoyed the video. If you have, please be sure to hit like and subscribe to my channel, and check out my other content too. And for everybody else, I'll see you next time on Chairman of the Board. Bye bye.